We've been discussing for the past few weeks the concept of the unity of God. That what is the unity of God when we say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad? What is the meaning of Echad? Echad doesn't mean he's one of a kind. He's one and only. Echad means everything emanates from him. There's nothing in existence which does not emanate from him. And when mankind will come to understand that through his own initiative, which is free choice, then ultimately God will reveal that reality, because we've achieved that through our own initiatives and through our own challenges. And that's called Shleimus Habriya. That's called the perfection of existence. But the objective is to recognize God as one. Now, when evil rears its head, it seems to indicate that God's not in control. You witness a Holocaust, 6 million Jews being murdered, 1 million children being killed, a level of barbarism, of evil, demonic behavior. God's people, if God is in control, how does this happen? And the questions are questions. What's the challenge? The challenge is, despite that, you have to steer the course and stay the course, that all this is, God is the true judge. And all the objective of all this is to ultimately achieve a level of what? Of understanding that nothing happens in existence for naught, and it's for a reason. And God is actually behind the scenes allowing this, and empowering these people to behave the way they're behaving. Although this level of reality seems to be contradictory to everything we believe. But despite that, if you still stay the course, you've met the challenge. And through that, we achieve within ourselves perfection. We're perfecting ourselves. Every test that we are able to withstand that test, what we call the test of fire, literally the test of fire. The Jews been through many situations which are more painful than the test of fire. And despite that, we still survive as a Jewish people. And we should have been annihilated. We were now approaching Purim. It was a decree to annihilate every man, woman, and child. It seemed to be there was no hope. No hope. And we were getting close to that date. And yet, at the last moment, what happens? God reverses the roles. Haman, who personifies Amalek, which is the most extreme level of antithesis to what God is all about. And he wants to eradicate, there shouldn't be a vestige of God's presence in this world and God's people. He doesn't realize that the queen is a Jewish woman. And the queen happens to be the niece of the leader of the Jewish people, would not bow to him, Mordechai. And he built a gallows to have Mordechai hanged on that gallows. At the last moment, what happens? Who's hanged on that gallows? Haman, and Achashverosh realizes all this. At the last moment, he reverses the roles. That the Jews are now given permission to kill the Amalekites on the 13th day of Adar. And they knew exactly who they were, because they were gloating, these Amalekites, waiting for that moment when they're going to swoop down and just slaughter the Jews. And they told them openly, tomorrow we're coming for you. So they knew exactly who they had to attack, and they attacked him, but they only had one day. And this is explained and articulated in the narrative of the reading of the Megillah. So it's Nahapachu. God inverted the roles. Our pursuers, we pursued them and we destroyed them. A moment earlier, it seemed to be It was over. No hope. Not a moment of hope. What did Mordechai do? He galvanized the Jews that they should repent, they should fast, make corrections in their behavior as Jews. And nobody questioned Mordechai due to his leadership. But you say, it doesn't make sense. It seems to be it's over. At the last moment, the sun shined at a level that you couldn't deny God's existence. They were like shocked into reality. God is in control. No revealed miracles, just the natural events which happened. Well, the way it started, the way it ended, God opened our eyes in a way, it was undeniable that God is behind the scenes, orchestrating every moment of this narrative from beginning till the end. And therefore, as a result of that, although the Sinai experience, God put the mountain over our heads, which was considered under coercion, there was a reaffirmation of reacceptance of Torah at the time of Purim, because the Jews understood the love God had for them, because they believed it was impossible that this decree could be undone. Impossible. And that God pulled the rug out from the Amalekites, the last moment, and say, Hashem Echad, I'm in control. And that you believed all this to be is only that you should appreciate who I am. So that evoked a level of clarity and understanding, which evoked the greatest level of love for God. And therefore, there's a reaffirmation of the acceptance of Torah, that the Jews were committed on another level to God. It was out of love, not due to coercion, that they were put under the mountain. You look at this world, God is in concealment. I don't know if you know, yesterday, there was, this past week, before Shabbos, there were texts sent out throughout to all the synagogues and houses of worship, Jewish, that it was proclaimed by the anti-Semites as a day of hate. This past Shabbos, I don't know if you're aware of it. It was known as a day of hate. And there were lurbas given out by all the police departments that they should be extra vigilant to people in the shuls and whatever security systems they have. They should be operating. If they notice anything, they should immediately contact the police department, the FBI, whatever it is. A day of hate. Could you imagine? The United States of America, there could be a day of hate, and we have to worry that what we believed all these years, this is the safe haven. Even in this safe haven, we see evil rearing its head. It's not to be believed. But despite that, we stay the course. Nothing could happen unless God wants it to happen. And if despite all this and seeing all the terrible things in the world and the victimization of Jews, the anti-Semitism, and you say, something that's all part of God's plan. Why? Do we understand all the nuances? The answer is no, we don't. But we understand, based on our belief, and based on our tradition, that these are challenges. And if you meet the challenges, then you've succeeded. And that brings about, ultimately, that God will reveal himself and give us greater levels of understanding, despite the darkness, that we'll see the light in the darkness. So Ramchal explains something interesting. We live in a world, God's in concealment. You have certain people who are psychic. What does it mean they're psychic? They have certain senses of certain realities. They have senses that the average person doesn't have, because they're psychic, these people. It's known for a fact that people who are autistic, because of their situation of autism, they have certain levels of clarity in certain areas which the average person does not have, due to their autistic state. there's certain people who are blind, they have certain senses, which we all have, but their senses are more acute to compensate because they can't see. So the blindness causes those senses should be more acute, which the person who could see, those senses, because he doesn't rely on them, he has sight, therefore those senses don't have the acuteness and the sensitivity which the blind person has. God says, despite this darkness, there are certain that will allow you to have abilities to sense many things, to bring you to a level of perfection, despite the lack of perfection in this world. What is that? It's the Torah and the mitzvos. Although the person who has that sense of truth and understanding of truth, it's like people say, I need empirical evidence that there's a God. The person who engages in Torah mitzvos, the more he engages, it becomes more reality in his life. Could you prove it to a third party? As much as we prove it intellectually, because as he say, things don't make sense unless there must be a God. The person says that's not sufficient proof to me. But the person who engages and is willing to invest in that belief and doing the Torah mitzvos, that brings about an inner sense of God's reality, because those are the mediums which allow us to have that sense. The person doesn't engage in that and doesn't even believe in God, he sees the world in a fog. And the fog is so thick, he has no sense of light. And he believes everything is what? Is based on, you have the peaks and the valleys in history. Everything is random. But the person who engages in the mediums which God provided, that despite the lack of his obvious presence, you're able to sense it. When King Solomon says in Mishlei, in Proverbs, Ner mitzvah Torah or, it's the ultimate spiritualization of the Jew. It takes those spiritual nerve endings and puts them in a position that we sense many things that the average person doesn't sense. And even if you study it and you don't believe, it doesn't really, you know what it all comes down to? It comes down to humility. If I don't understand, it must not be. If I don't understand, okay? But you understand, we go back to the beginning of our history, and there is a starting point. That starting point, God says, proved beyond any doubt, irrefutable truth. God is the omnipotent, only being who wills this existence. That's the launch pad. It's called Sinai. And God tells us up front, if you do this, you'll have that. And if you fail, you can experience this. And the narrative in the Torah evolves and happens exactly as God said it should be. Exactly. And if you read the narrative, but I need empirical evidence. Why don't you read the original narrative, which God gave to us at Sinai through Moshe, who was a spokesman, where every Jew saw and prophesied himself that was reality. Why did you accept it? Well, I question whether that ever happened. Okay, that's your choice. Now, I once told over a story. The Iranians, the Jewish family, sent their children to the United States before the Shah fell. And they were very wealthy, the Jews in Iran, and they sent out of the country a significant part of their wealth because they understood once the Khomeini takes over, it's going to be a different reality for the Jewish people. So there were about 1,000 young boys and girls that were sent to the United States and to Europe, certain countries, mainly to the United States. And near Yisrael, where I was, Baltimore, the rabbi, his name is Rabbi Neuberger, Zechat Tzarek Livrocha, was a special person. And he created a curriculum for these Iranian boys that they should be able to be educated Jewishly, because whatever, even though they were observant, it was literally a paltry level of observance because it was really ignorance. They weren't educated properly. And the Torah in the Persian community in the United States is only to what this rabbi did on them for them. It was known, many Persian, these young men and women, they went to Atlanta, Georgia. And many of them went to Emory University in Atlanta. And many of them, because there was no supportive environment Jewishly, they gave it up totally. Many of them ended up marrying out. Because, if you don't have some semblance of support system, it's almost impossible to survive. And the ones who came to Baltimore, they had about 100 students in the yeshiva, and some of the siblings were in Johns Hopkins University, Maryland, Loyola, these are the universities in Baltimore. And they were very committed, the students who came, because they understood what they had here, they didn't have at home. And they were very dedicated, although it took a long time to bring them up to par where they should have been. And there was a young man, and he shares with me that his older brother, who lives in the city, has a non-Jewish girlfriend, and he's living with her in his apartment in the city. And there's people, they came from the city of Shiraz, which was one of the cities in Iran, is all observant Jews. Shiraz was considered an observant community. And the families go back 1,000 years. They lived in that same location for 1,000 years. The families were observant. At that level of observance, the older brother comes here. He's influenced. He did not come to the yeshiva. He enrolled in university. And sometimes he asks his brother to come. He'd like to see him. So he goes to the city and stays in his apartment. So he says to me, I'm really not comfortable to be there. Here, I'm in his apartment. And I know in the next room, he's with his non-Jewish girlfriend. He says, I have a problem. I can't go. So he says to me, what should I do? So I said, tell your brother I want to speak to him. So his brother comes to see me. And I say to him, I understand from what your brother is telling me, from where you come from, Shiraz, this could have never happened. But now all of a sudden, your behavior is not as you were raised by your families. He says, what's wrong with it? I said, what's wrong with it? Because if you read the Torah, you're crossing a line that's not acceptable. He says, and who says the Torah has any authenticity? Who said it's an authentic script of God? Who said? I said, well, there were 3-4 million Jews at Sinai who openly witnessed God speaking to them. So he says to me, but I wasn't there. How do I know it's true? How do I know it's true? I said, because the people were there, they shared it with their children, and the children with their children, and therefore, and nobody ever claimed that was a made-up story. So evidently, usually you have defectors, they say differently. No, there were no defectors. You say other religions, you have a handful of people. So they concocted a story. He have millions of people, and among the millions of people, there are no defectors saying it didn't happen. So evidently, seemingly, that's pretty irrefutable proof that it did happen. He says, but I wasn't there. So I question whether it ever happened. So I said to him, I want to ask you a question. I said, do you believe in the Holocaust? He says, yes. Do you believe 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis, by the Germans? Yes. He says, well, 6 million, more or less. I bet, but do you believe that this event took place? Yes. I said, but you weren't old enough. You weren't born at the time of the Holocaust. Why do you believe it happened? Today they could recreate any film as if it happened, but it never happened. But why do you accept it? The answer is because the people who experienced it, they said they experienced it and they passed it on to their families. It's no different here. And nobody questioned it, but you accept it. So he says to me, I want to tell you the truth. Whether there was a Holocaust or not a Holocaust, really doesn't make a difference in my life. He says, I know factually there's such a thing as anti-Semitism. It exists. Was it to that degree, not to that degree, but I know it exists. Therefore, whether there was a Holocaust or not doesn't change my life. I live my life the same way. But whether there's a Sinai or not a Sinai, that makes a difference how I live my life. So unless it's proven to me that it did happen, I do what I believe, what I want to do. That's what he said to me. You understand? If you don't believe in the event where it all started, that God is the omnipotent, everything he's echod, everything emanates from him. But as time passes, the challenges, we see things which seem to be maybe God forbid, checked out. Because otherwise, how does he allow such things to happen? But he, in his narrative, he writes there, if you don't follow my way, these things are going to happen. Literally to the T. Every detail. What happened is described in the Torah, is going to happen. But yet, when you experience it, it creates questions in your mind. How could it be? It doesn't all add up. It doesn't make sense. If we're his chosen people, how does he allow this thing to happen? Because God has gone into concealment. And the challenge now is, despite the concealment, despite all the questions, you still toe the line. And if you toe the line and you do the mitzvos and you invest in those mediums, although you may not be able to affect another person, but I'll give you an example. You taste something and it tastes sweet and it's nutritious and you become invigorated from it. Another person never tasted anything of that nature of taste. Could you describe that taste to that person where there's nothing which is equivalent out of that taste? There's no frame of reference that you can even share it with them. Unless you taste it yourself, you don't know what it tastes like. The person who engages in the medium of Torah mitzvos, you're engaging in the medium which gives you a sense of God, the unity of God. But if you don't engage in it, and God's presence is not obvious, how do you prove it to that person? It's much more difficult. So God allows those handful of people relative to the world to have mediums which could counter all the questions. But again, we don't have the answers. We don't have the answers. But you know what you have? You have no question. If you have the question, I always say you have no answer. But if you don't have the question, not understanding something is not a question. I don't understand. But I know the truth. Why, when, how? I don't know. Only God knows. But is God orchestrating whatever's happening? The answer is yes. Understanding that's called unity of God. Everything that happens is only because God is allowing it to happen the way it's happening. But you can only have that sense of truth if you engage in the mediums which allow you to be touched by truth. So I just thought about something today, very interesting. The Minchas tells us that Adam was shown all the future generations that are going to be born into existence. And God shows him a soul, which he recognizes a very special neshama, special soul. And Adam asks God, what exactly is the soul? Says it's a very special soul, but it's only meant to live a few hours. And then this child's going to die. This newborn's going to die. So Adam says, I'm willing to give 70 years of my life to this soul, this special soul, that the soul is so special that it should be able to actualize its ability. I give 70 years of my life. Adam initially was meant to live 1,000 years because he gave 70 years to this special soul. Adam lived 930 years, not 1,000 years. Who was the special soul? You know who it was? David HaMelech, King David. King David was that special soul. Now let's understand. This is what touched me this morning. When you say the morning service, before we come to the Shema and the blessings of the Shema, we have verses that refer to as Psuki de Zimra, verses of song, of praise of God. And it's all, every one of those verses are part of Psalms, part of Tehillim. These are David's words describing God. If you study Tehillim, if you saw what David endured in his lifetime, how he was a fugitive and how he was pursued and his enemies and everything. And with all that, the way he expresses himself, and he articulates it, understanding that every nuance is God's orchestrating, and his faith and belief in God is at a level not to be believed. And he understands nature, everything. And that's what these verses are, these Psalms, these chapters we say in the morning. We live in a world where God is not even noticeable. And we as Jews, we say the Psalms of the morning. Chapter after chapter, hallelujah, praise this God. And he goes and articulates in each chapter the physical existence, whatever happens, what God's interested in. So we as Jews, and when you say it and you're touched and you believe it, and you're inspired by it, you know what that means to God? We're addressing the objective of existence. We're meeting the challenge. If you say those Psukim de Zimra, those verses in the morning, those Psalms in the morning, before you get to the Shema, before you say Echad, Echad is the unity of God. It's the declaration of God's unity. We've already said who God is. There's nothing in existence which does not come about because God willed it should come about. Whether it's the species, whether it's nature, whether it's events, whatever it may be, it's halukah. It's all praised as God. And then we speak about Vayivarach David, how God blessed, David blessed God. And then we say the Oz Yashir. We articulate the miracles of the splitting of the sea and all the various nuances, which are the words of Moshe Rabbeinu. How he depicted and articulated the 250 miracles which took place, which is the hand of God. And we say this, and we believe it. But saying that, how do we reconcile it, what's going on in this world? We can't reconcile it. As I said, we don't have the answers, but we don't have the question. If you don't have the question, you don't need the answer. Because I have the belief and I have the understanding that God is the one who orchestrates and choreographs everything with a reason which is in our best interest. So now, when we say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, which is the unity of God, even though we say everything emanates from God, and we understand everything's a challenge, but we get very often, or most often, we delude ourselves. We know something is not appropriate, but yet we cross those lines. But we know the truth, and we believe it. You could say the 13 tenets of Jewish belief. But despite believing that without a question, yet our behavior is not in sync with what we believe. That's the challenge of life. So conceptually, we believe. What is the ultimate success? To take that concept, the belief, and internalize it. And the more you internalize it, the more it becomes a reality, and we delude ourselves to a lesser degree. We only delude ourselves because it's something which is outside of us. But if it's within ourselves, you don't delude yourself because you have a sense of the wrong that you're doing. I'll give you an example. A person is healthy and young. His nerve endings have a very acute sense of heat and cold. When he touches something hot and he realizes it gets too close to the source of that heat, he will get burnt. He's keeping his distance because those nerve endings are fully functional and they function the way they're supposed to give you that level of detection to keep your distance. As a person gets older and he has neuropathy, and he doesn't have those senses, and he touches something where when he feels the warmth, he's already being burnt. Then it's already destructive because he doesn't have that sense. So all our nerving endings, due to all the exiles and environments we find ourselves, everything's been dulled. We say, we've been dumbed down. Literally dumbed down. Literally. That's where we're at. Now, how do you become a little more intelligent, more effective, more functional? In the physical sense, we know therapies, infusions of nutrition, vitamins, whatever. But spiritually speaking, how? We have mediums. It's called Torah mitzvos. God gave us those mediums. That despite environments, it gives us a sense of truth, not only a sense of truth, it allows us, the more we engage in it, to internalize that truth. And the more you internalize it, the more you're touched by it, the less you delude yourself, because we realize we're only fooling ourselves. But there's always a level of challenge because we are physical beings, but that's always the challenge. But it's a challenge that we can meet that challenge because we have the sense, are we going to delude ourselves or we cannot delude ourselves? So in terms conceptually, we say, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. We believe everything emanates from God. That's the unity of God. When we articulated all the Psalms in Psukim Zimran, the verses of praise, we articulated the reality of God, nature, seasons, mankind, power. It's all God. They're the words of David. So it's very interesting. The Ramchal speaks about Adam had a challenge. He's put in the Garden of Eden. God says you can eat of all the fruits, of all the trees of the Garden of Eden, except there's one tree you should not eat, from the tree of knowledge. It's a tree of good and evil. Now, he explains that when God created Adam, he created evil. He gave Adam, although he had no internal desire, which drove him towards that, like a magnetic pull towards that, there's a magnetism, but nevertheless, he had an understanding of what evil was. I'll give you the example. If I ask you to describe to me what does an angel look like, it is impossible for a human being, because the human faculty has no relevance to be able to process whatever that is. It's a different realm of existence. We function within a physical existence. So the faculties we were endowed with only relate to physical existence. To the spiritual, we don't have the faculties to process that. If God wouldn't have given Adam the ability to have relevance to evil, you could see it, it could be before your eyes. You just pass right over it. But he gave him the capacity that he could understand what evil is. So there was an entry point into his being that if it's attractive, now he has to make a decision. Am I going there or am I not going there? Is he going to delude himself? And the Ramchal explains, the level of understanding and clarity Adam had was one of a kind. But he deluded himself because he had because the Torah describes it was attractive to the eyes. It was something which had a level of beauty and attraction, which was one of a kind. And Adam knew what he was being confronted with. But he rationalized and justified it. I'll give you an example. The Arizal explains in what context did he justify eating the tree of knowledge? I've said this in the past. The Arizal says, we read in Pirkei Avos, L'fum tzara agro, that when we do a mitzvah, and despite the challenge, we succeed and do the mitzvah, regardless, the level of reward is greater because it shows a greater level of dedication. That despite the difficulty, you succeeded. Adam felt like this. Well, if he eats of the tree of knowledge, what happens to him? He becomes addicted to evil. Despite that level of addiction, And despite the level of lack of clarity, he will make the right decision. Adam will make the right decision. And as a result of that, he'll be a greater servant of God, because today everything is black and white. It's clear. So to do the right thing comes with relatively easiness. After I eat, it's very complicated. I will want to show God I have a level of dedication to him. Despite the difficulty, I will do the right thing. God's not asking for heroics. Just don't eat it. The answer is, you know why? Because he had a desire for it. Because God created with an understanding that he understood what evil was. And evil has a certain delusional side to it. And you could delude yourself to satisfy something. And because of what he did, he took the world down. And the world's of Ramchal, what could have been achieved by the end of the sixth day, to bring the world to a state of perfection, was still contending with it for 6,000 years. Could you imagine? Adam sinned right before midday, Friday afternoon. And yet, if he would have stayed the course, not eat, when Shabbos began, the world would have reached a level of perfection. He would have been perfected everything. Because he failed and he deluded himself with spending 6,000 years to achieve that level of perfection, which could have taken place in a moment, in a context of moments. That's what happened. But despite that, as he explains, we have mediums, which God provides us. But again, the challenges are different from challenges. And the more people fail, we empower evil. So it becomes more difficult. We find during the temple period, if you walk into the Beis HaMikdash temple, you were able to see 10 miracles every single day. And yet, the Jews went after idolatry, adultery, incest, and murder. If you see the hand of God so clear, how do you go off the cliff? They're prophets, but there was a counterforce. They were prophets of the idolatry. They were able to manipulate forces. So you had to make there were challenges. You had to make a choice. The prophets of God versus the prophets of Baal, which was a deity. Who do you follow? That's the challenge. There's always a challenge. Despite God's obvious presence, there's another presence which seems to be as obvious. Now you have to make a choice. So there were always challenges. But the reason why they're challenges is because of what Adam did initially when he ate of the tree of knowledge. He infused the world with evil. Evil is intermeshed into every aspect of our being. What we eat. Rav Chaim Volozhiner writes that before Adam ate of the tree of knowledge, the food, we find the Jews, when we were in the desert, we were sustained with the manna. The mun, what we call the mun in Hebrew, there was no waste. The Jews didn't have to do their bodily functions. Why? Because the only reason why a person has to do bodily functions is because the body has to expel that part of the food which is inedible. Why? Why does it have to? Because he says that's a result of the sin of the tree of knowledge. That represents the evil. Before that, there was nothing in existence that didn't have value. Before he ate of tree of knowledge, fruits, vegetables didn't have husks. There's no inedible part of that fruit. Everything was fully digested and remained absorbed in the system. Only as, he says, that's the reason why the law is that human excrement, you're not permitted to study Torah in its proximity. It has to be buried. It has to be removed. He says, why? The answer is because why does the person expel that from his body? Because that itself is the representation of the evil as a result of Adam eating of the tree of knowledge. So because that represents the evil, God says, you're not permitted, your camp is not clean, it's not holy. It has to be buried, it has to be disposed of. It cannot be within your proximity. But that's what it's all about. If Adam wouldn't have eaten, there'd be no such things. We'd live a life like the Jews lived in the desert for 40 years. Everything was absorbed into their innards. There was nothing expelled from their bodies. So we contend with for 6,000 years since then is because what Adam didn't do. The founding father of the Jewish people is Avraham Avinu, Abraham the patriarch. Despite he was born in a world which was devoid of God's presence, through his own initiative, he came upon God. He was the location of the Shekhinah. Although there was no Mishkan, there was no temple, where was God's location in this existence? Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the patriarchs, they were the location, because they were able to achieve within themselves a level of perfection that the divine presence could have relevance to them. Could be his location in this existence. At Sinai, it was a whole different reality. We became God's people, his chosen people. Many of the handicaps of Adam no longer had relevance to us. Therefore, now the Torah, these mechanisms, these mediums, the Torah and mitzvahs are able, despite the darkness, they're able to give us a sense of clarity and understanding that God is the omnipotent one, everything emanates from him. So when we say the Psuki de Zimra, and you're at a certain level, you're touched by it, Haluka, and you say it slowly. The Ramchal writes in the Derech Hashem, the way of God, if you ever notice, on Shabbos, Psuki de Zimra is much longer. There's the weekday Psalms, verses of praise, and Shabbos, it's much more lengthy. Why? Why is Shabbos more lengthy? So he explains, the Ramchal in the way of God, that Shabbos, the Talmud tells us, is Me'in Olam Haba. It has a semblance of the world to come. The day is a bastion of spirituality, because God enters into existence on the seventh day. As the seventh day of creation, God entered into existence when creation was completed. Every seventh day he enters into this creation. And if a Jew observes Shabbos as it's meant to be observed, you could be a beneficiary of that spirituality if you observe it. But to maximize on that opportunity, when we articulate the praises of God through the Psalms of Psuki de Zimra, we become greater beneficiaries. So because there's more of God's presence available to us, proximity-wise, you have to be worthy. So if you acknowledge it and recognize it and believe it to be, you become impacted to a greater degree, you're touched to a greater degree on Shabbos, because that spiritual light, which visually we don't see, is available. Then, we speak about Shabbos is Yom Menucha. It's a day of rest. What do you mean it's a day of rest? You can take it off any day of the week and you can have a day of rest. And we say, Bo Shabbos Bo Menucha. When Shabbos came, we had rest. We had tranquility. What is it? The ultimate menucha, when you're at peace, when you come in contact with the ultimate. We came in contact with God, entered into existence. He created the seventh day, that although it's a 24-hour period, but it's a different day. In reality, it has another capacity. The weekday doesn't have the capacity to receive God's presence. The seventh day of the week, although as humans, we see it as a 24-hour day as every other day, but its innateness, it has another capacity. It has a capacity to receive God's presence in a physical existence. We, being his people, we can be beneficiaries of that. When? If you observe the Shabbos, you keep the 39 areas of creative activity and you abide by them. You sanctify the day by saying Kiddush, positive commandment, declaring that God's the creator of this existence. That allows us to become beneficiaries of that relationship. There's another level of light that we become beneficiaries of. God's illumination, God's countenance. During the week, it's not there. But through the mediums of Torah and mitzvos, we generate that light and we become beneficiaries. And the more we become beneficiaries, we advance further. And despite the darkness of this world, we have a sense of truth. As I said, although I can't prove it to a third party, because intellectually I could, but the other person doesn't have the capacity to be touched sufficiently that he should make a commitment to it, unless you engage in it itself. That's what it's all about. So Adam, after he failed and he took existence down, when he saw this soul, he gave 70 years of his life. So the 70 years of David's life, what did he achieve? That was a correction. That's the means, that's the medium through which we correct Adam's failing. By singing, by articulating all what he articulates in Psalms, which we do, every Jew does every morning, 7 days a week. More or less, that articulation brings about that level of perfection within ourselves, which ultimately will lead us to the end of the 6,000th year, which is the equivalent of the end of the sixth day. It takes us 6,000 years to accomplish what Adam could have accomplished by the end of that sixth day. So if we go and we engage sufficiently in all these mediums, which many of them are articulated by David, to give us an understanding of what this world is all about, then we achieve what Adam did not achieve, and that would be a correction on his failing. You know, the Alta of Kelm, which was the closest student of Rabbi Yisrael, says, King David says in Psalms, Hashemayim misaprin krot keil. Heavens speak of God's glory. So he says, the average person looks at heavens. You know, you still see the Milky Way, you see this, and now we're coming through various telescopes. We realize there are trillions of stars, even beyond that. Galaxies not to be believed. So what is it? It's amazing. It's amazing. But after you finish being amazed, what do? You go to a McDonald's and you stuff your mouth with a cheeseburger, right? Or you go to Monaco, or you go to Las Vegas, and you go to Atlantic City, you know, and you go to the casino. It's amazing. If you understand that heaven speaks God's praises, you know exactly where to go, where not to go. Because you understand what existence is meant to be. It's opportunity which provides us to have relevance to the infinite. So do you pass on the infinite for something which is only a facade of reality, which is not real? It's only to be revealed after 6,000 years, or when Mashiach comes. In retrospect, in hindsight, everything's 2020. But it'll be 2020 on an absolute level, because there's not going to be any evil inclination any longer. But by then, it's too late. It's too late, because we no longer have choice. Once Mashiach comes, opportunity is not there any longer. It's only has value because we could have chosen yes or no. Once you no longer have in a position to choose, we're stuck. You're stuck exactly where you chose to be. I chose to be here. I chose to be on the golf green. Okay, you can be on the golf green. You know, the sheep in New Zealand, they're also on the green. You know, they're undermining, global warming. You know, they're creating it because what they do. So you could also be on the golf green with your caddy and your golf clubs and whatever you have there. And you go to the, whatever the dining room is in the country club there. Elite kosher style, pastrami and corned beef. It's all meaningless. And these people believe, we got a Jewish country club, but you can't join unless you're part of Forbes 500, or you earn a minimum, and the fee is $1 million to belong to this country club. There's a country club out in Long Island, $1 million fee. That's what it costs. You know what it means? That we don't let these little peons into this club. You got to be able to afford to pay it, and they pride themselves. Who could pay it? all of a sudden, this guy who created this Ponzi scheme, he joins. They're all excited. Then they find out the band's a fraud. Okay. Then all of a sudden, each one realizes they're all under investigation. They're all frauds. And at the end of the time, it'll be revealed it's all fraud. It's all fraudulent. They were hoodwinked by the evil inclination. Because their ego didn't allow them. Judaism is archaic, it's backward, it's that, you're provincial. We're beyond that, progressive, this and that. But yet Saturday was proclaimed as a day of hate. They're all Jews. You could be whoever you are, it's irrelevant. You're Jewish, is anti-Semitism. It's a rude awakening. Well, I could afford a security team to watch me. I could afford it. But if you're supposed to be God's gift to America, because you're the ultimate financier, why do they hate you? And eventually the government will hate you. What happened in Germany? They didn't want to hear about what you provided, what you contributed. Wherever it's in the arts and finance, we don't want to hear about it. In medicine, we don't want to hear about it. It was a rude awakening. And they couldn't understand it. So they tried to find who's the culprit that caused this. The religious Jews. They painted us in an ugly picture. Therefore, we're being victimized because of them. People delude themselves. Because you only have relevance to truth if you're touched by truth. And the only way you could be touched by truth is with the medium, which is called Torah Mitzvos, which was given to us at Sinai so many thousand years ago.